Support for this show comes from Aon's Health Solutions. A thriving organization starts with a thriving workforce, but providing quality health and benefits today requires bold action. Aon is your ally in challenging the status quo. With predictive analytics to forecast your health risks, expertise to transform insights into innovative and financially sustainable solutions, and tailored strategies to meet the unique needs of your people and organization. The time for convention is over. The time for better benefits decisions is now. Visit aon.com to learn more. It's hard to be a reader in 2024. Between emails, alerts, and the constant pull of the algorithm, the distractions seem endless. That's why reading technology company Soul designed the Soul Reader, a wearable e-reader that helps you shut out the world and get back to reading. Slip on the Soul Reader like a pair of glasses, lay back, and the pages are on an e-ink screen right there in front of you. It's noise canceling for your eyes. Check out the Soul Reader at soulreader.com to start reading without distraction.
Would you rather live in a place where police prevent the most crimes or make the most arrests? It seems preferable to me to keep the bad stuff from happening in the first place. The problem is, like a lot of institutions, modern police departments have embraced quantification as a way to know which officers deserve to be promoted. And it's a lot easier to count after the fact arrests than crimes that never took place. From KERA in Dallas, this is Think. I'm Krys Boyd. As a newly sworn-in NYPD officer in the late aughts, my guest realized how that contributes to unequal patterns of enforcement based on race, whereby people of color get stopped specifically because police think they're more likely to have a prior record of having been stopped by police, meaning there is justification for booking them into jail. As a New Yorker of Haitian descent, Edwin Raymond had experienced police harassment growing up and wanted to be a different sort of presence in the community. But the system he was part of did not make that easy. Raymond served for 15 years on the force of the New York Police Department and today is a criminal justice reform advocate and author of a new book called An Inconvenient Cop, My Fight to Change Policing in America. Edwin, welcome to Think.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's an honor and pleasure.
You write about this inescapable tension police officers experience between the people they are supposed to serve and the system that provides for them as officers, the police departments. Why are those things in conflict?
Well, at the end of the day, police, it's supposed to be a tax-funded service, a tax-funded public good, but much of the policy is detrimental to certain members of the public. So these are just, contrasting ideas that the upper echelon, their aim is public safety. And what I learned is they often believe they're doing the right thing. They don't see the collateral damage or the externalities in the policy because they essentially have tunnel vision on just dealing, stopping crime, focusing on crime, even if they have to ignore the Constitution.
So you served on the force of the NYPD, and your stories in this book come from those years, but your sense is that the conditions you describe broadly probably exist, in most cities, in most police departments in the United States.
Oh, absolutely. Not only is the NYPD the largest police department by far in this nation, it's the most funded, and it's one of probably the most famous police department in the world. And smaller police departments, even some other major cities, when they're looking for leadership, new leadership, they often go to either retiring or recently retired NYPD chiefs and other assistant commissioners. And what they do is they essentially recreate what they know. That one of the earliest examples of this is Chief Timoney, who went to Miami and created the system, and as recent as Chief McCarthy in Chicago, all reared in the NYPD. They literally tried to recreate the NYPD in these other cities.
I want to get the bad apples thing out of the way. People think that, there are bad apples in these systems ruining the reputation of all cops everywhere. Your experience is that the rot that preserves racial hierarchies and perpetuates injustices is actually a process that starts with police academy training.
Yeah, it's the soil. I refer to it more as the soil that produces the apple. It police are not nearly as autonomous as people may think, right? One of the things that caused me to join the police department were the detriments that I experienced with police as a teenager. And you assume at that time that the cop that's interacting with you, bothering you while you're just trying to walk to the subway to go to school, or you're coming from work. I had a job as a teenager. You assume that it's who they are, who they want to be. And when it's a white man, it's easy to say, okay, he's just racist. When I joined the police department, one of the first things that they forced you to do is just conform to rules. They call it discipline, but what they're doing is they're conditioning you to not question. And that starts as early as the police academy. So by the time you finish the academy 6 months later, no matter how much what's being asked of you is immoral and unethical and against your personal views and ways of seeing the world, you don't question it. And some more than just conform, they absorb it and they perpetuate it.
Yeah, your first experience, your first impression entering the police academy in 2008 was that this was really run like a paramilitary organization.
100%. And this, it's we're literally told this is a paramilitary organization
Hmm.
modeled after the U.S. Army specifically.
So then why did you become a police officer?
Well, it was those negative encounters that I had. I was tired of it. I didn't understand. And there was one particular encounter where I was walking with, I was 18 years old, walking with my girlfriend at the time, and the officers were plainclothes officers in an unmarked vehicle. They completely just mishandled and disrespected me. And two things: my friend's parents were walking by, and when someone's getting searched, some people stop and watch, and I felt so embarrassed. And opposite that corner were people that were actually involved in serious crimes, criminality, watching me get searched. And I realized these officers can't tell the difference. Because the fact that we share the same race and ethnicity is all they need to know. But then the final pillar in that particular encounter was that the main officer, the more aggressive officer, was actually a black man. And prior to that, I didn't have interactions with black officers. It was always white males. And that one, it wouldn't leave me. As time went on, I kept thinking about it. And that's when I made the decision. In order to understand why this happens, and most importantly, what can be done about it, I'm going to join this thing. I made the decision at 18, and 4 years later, at 22, I actually joined.
So, when you were in the academy, you did learn a little bit about the Frank Serpico era and the kind of corruption within the NYPD, I think in the early 70s, that he blew the whistle on. Just very quickly, can you just summarize for us in a couple of sentences what that was about for people who maybe didn't see the biopic?
Yeah. Prior to the academy, I had never heard of Frank Serpico, despite the American classic film in which a young Al Pacino plays him. And in history, it goes down as the Knapp Commission, named after the judge that I believe the Mayor Lindsay, um, gave the task of investigating Serpico's claims. And in those days, it was more of the traditional corruption. When people think of police corruption, what they think of where cops are getting bribed and involved in drugs and transporting drugs, using drugs, you name it. Anything that had money, prostitution, in order for legitimate businesses and alternative economies, if you will, to operate, they all had to pay a percentage to the police department every week. Officers would collect from mafia, from pimps, from legitimate businesses every week, brown paper bags full of cash.
All right, so that is not happening in the same way at the same scale by any means anymore. But what you realized when you heard this story in the academy is that, like, the repairs made to fix this were sort of shallow and cosmetic. Like, what is this about the coffee policy?
Yeah, so because of Serpico, that wide scale, more traditional corruption, it was minimized, but it wasn't eliminated. Fast forward 10 years later, an officer named Michael Dowd, um, that goes down in history as the Mullen Commission, he basically at first was arresting drug dealers and seeing that when he would arrest them and search them, they had more money in their pockets than he would make in months. And then within days, he'll see them again, still again making money. And he cops back in those days, cops did not pay at restaurants, and he, especially when it came to cups of coffee. So he made the determination, if he's able to get away with not paying for this cup of coffee, what else could he do? And that's when he started going down the rabbit hole of the more traditional corruption. And instead of arresting the drug dealers, he'd just take the drugs from them and sell it to other dealers. Um, when when Officer Dowd was arrested and tried, and the commission started for a partial immunity, he was basically told, just tell us why, tell us everything, and we'll go easy on you. And he explained it all started with a cup of coffee. And one of the things that came from that is officers were no longer allowed to take free cups of coffee, almost completely missing the bigger picture of what's going on.
So your training, as you recall it, never addressed racial profiling one way or another, which is to say you weren't taught to avoid it, but you also weren't instructed to do it. You did start to encounter unconscious bias, though, as early as your days in the academy.
Correct. And, we were given examples of racial profiling versus criminal profiling, but then immediately we were essentially taught how to make racial profiling fit into the parameters of criminal profiling, essentially how to justify racial profiling. So that the fact that it's a problem and it shouldn't be, that's not what the concentration was, unfortunately. So this is why I say we were never really taught properly about racial profiling.
Yeah, so you had an instructor, who talked about accidentally having officers look like perps, and he was referring to brown and black officers.
Correct. It was towards the end of the police academy, maybe 3 weeks before we graduate. That's when we actually get our badges and our guns. We call it Gun and Shield Day. It's our own internal ceremony. And he came in to give us some advice, and he meant well. But this is the power of implicit bias. He said, when you get out to different neighborhoods, you see a black or Spanish guy with a gun, don't just pull out and start blasting. Find cover. Use your tactics that you learned in the gym, because you never know. The department is getting more and more diverse. We're starting to look more and more like perps, making the connection that black and brown people are perps, But if you were to ask him that directly, his conscious mind would know better than to say that. But the Freudian slip, the implicit bias was there. And, I think I was the only one that kind of caught it, unfortunately. But that's just how powerful implicit bias is. Even in warning us against implicit bias, he was using implicit bias unknowingly.
So when you were in the academy, did you think to yourself, is anyone else hearing this the way I'm hearing it?
100%. I realize, as with so many other institutions, people were just trying to complete their tasks so they can go on with their careers. The way that I decided at 18 to go in with a very analytic, perspective of trying to understand the system, that I realized my peers weren't really there for that reason. So unfortunately, they weren't paying attention. I went in with the microscope. I was looking for these issues, whereas other folks were just trying to get a job.
All right, Edwin, your first assignment was a transit station post in Brooklyn, which had actually been your first choice. What was your job there day to day?
Our main focus was fare evasion, right? People jumping the turnstile, theft of service, as it's called officially. That was it. That was the goal. And what was odd was the way in which we got those arrests and wrote those tickets. We had to hide, right? In the subway system in New York City, all throughout the subway system, there are doors, there are rooms with vents, and officers would be in the rooms, peeking through the vents, watching the subway turnstiles, waiting for someone to beat the fare, to run the name, hoping that there's a warrant to effect an arrest. If there's no warrant, they would write a summons and go back in the room and just repeat that process every day until the quotas were met. We were given enforcement quotas, which came in a trifecta. There were a certain amount of arrests, a certain amount of tickets, and a certain amount of stop and frisk that we had to make every single month.
Are those quotas legal?
Quotas, enforcement quotas are unlawful in New York City, New York State, and most of the nation. Officers, yeah, cannot have enforcement quotas legally, but unofficially, de facto, they exist.
So at first you were confused because you thought, well, look, if we're trying to, make sure that the transit system gets all its fare money, we should just post a uniformed officer right by the station, the turnstile, and then people will not jump the fare.
Exactly. As you know, you put a guardian there to deter the behavior, especially because we're talking about $2.50. Not the crime of the century, not all the money of the world, but this is where you insert broken windows policing. Something else we were taught in the police academy as if it was empirical, but it's a theory that's yet to be proven. And even the original architects of broken windows have said that police departments, including the NYPD, have misused their research and data to justify zero tolerance policing, and that's not what broken windows was supposed to be. But that's how it's used, not just in the transit system, but throughout the entire city, in Black and brown neighborhoods, and when dealing with Black and brown people.
So the idea, and please correct me if I don't have this right, the idea of broken windows policing is that if you go after like these minor violations, you create a culture where people are less inclined to do more substantial crimes, create more substantial problems.
Essentially, yeah, it serves as a psychological deterrent, saying that because we're not letting the small things go, you better not think about doing anything more egregious. But in reality, it's not factual. Not to mention, because of broken windows enforcement, we see year after year the data of what gets enforced, and the number one summons written is unlawful, open container of alcohol, unlawful consumption of alcohol in public. The number one arrest is unlawful possession of marijuana. These are both substance related offenses, things that happen, according to the Department of Health, if not at the same rate, possibly higher in white communities. So if this behavior was tethered to homicides and robberies and the violent felonies that broken windows is supposed to essentially suppress, then why is it that in the communities where these behaviors are happening at higher rates, we don't necessarily have those violent crimes? It's one of those things where there's correlation without causation. The theory. One of the biggest advocates of the theory is former police commissioner William Bratton, and he was even questioned about the lack of empirical support because he's an academic, and he admits that while it can't be supported empirically, his gut tells him that it works. And to me, that's so disrespectful to Black and brown communities that we are essentially being told to rely on your gut that's been proven wrong over and over again.
How do overtime pay structures, or what some officers call collars for dollars, factor into all of this?
Yeah, there are several ways in which officers can earn more money. One of them is just wait towards the end of their shift, right? Something that they may have ignored in the 2 hours into their shift, in the final 2 hours of the shift, of a essentially 8 hour shift, all of a sudden they're eagle-eyed and enforcing, but in hopes that the person is arrested, because the time that it takes to process the arrest paperwork, once you go over your shift, you're essentially earning more money. You're paid at a higher rate. You do this enough throughout the week, throughout the months, that's tens of thousands of dollars more annually. And there are people that their entire livelihoods are based on that salary and not their actual salary. Their entire livelihood is based on the additional $30,000 to $80,000 that they're able to make from collars for dollars versus their actual base salary.
So this is how officers add to their incomes now in the post-Serpico era. They're not getting richer by going around the system. They're getting extra money by leaning into the system.
Correct. Correct, Krys.
All right. You also found that there were officers who looked to make an arrest just to escape the elements. Can you talk about bodying up?
Yeah, the term bodying up is just quickly getting an arrest. You know, we're told a good officer is never cold, never wet, and never too hot. Why? Because that's where you body up. You get an arrest, that puts you inside. Once you're inside, if it could be 95 degrees outside, it's 65 degrees in the building because of the air conditioner. If it's raining outside, inside will be wet, and if it's cold, outside, inside will be nice and warm. So as long as you keep bodying up, you will never be in the wrong climate.
Hmm.
Yeah.
What was CompStat, or what is CompStat?
So ComStat is you see, there's some parts of ComStat that I think make sense. The problem is when you merge it with broken windows and zero tolerance quota policing. ComStat essentially tries to it highlights problematic areas where certain major crimes are taking place. Right, there's 7 crimes that police law enforcement agencies have to report annually to the FBI, and this is essentially how um, safety is measured. And the crimes are murder, rape, robbery, attempted murder, burglary, larceny, grand larceny, and grand larceny auto. So obviously, some jurisdictions have different names for these infractions, but that's essentially, we call them the 7 majors or the 7 index crimes. CompStat measures those crimes primarily and other crimes, but those are the main things that CompStat measures. And basically, commanders in charge of the jurisdictions, the precincts, they're responsible for addressing the crime. They're responsible for doing something about crime patterns or spikes in crime. You see, that to me is common sense, good police work. But the problem is what's accepted as a response to a spike in crime. And insert broken windows again. As long as officers have increased writing summonses, conducting stop and frisk, and arresting people within the vicinity of a violent crime, that commander would be safe, meaning the chiefs would not drill into that commander the same way because he or she is shown that they are trying to do something about the crime. And again, believing that enforcing those small things is the something to do is part of the problem, because if I live in a neighborhood that's unfortunately struggling with violence, what is heavily ticketing me going to do about someone that's robbing people or shooting people? Absolutely nothing. But this is how CompStat operates. This is how Broken Windows operates.
And in some ways, CompStat turned out to be useless anyway because, as you learned, officers who needed to meet expectations about those 7 major crimes that you talked about could find ways of kind of disappearing or downgrading things that happened on their watch.
Yeah, we called it cooking the books. Essentially reclassifying crimes. If someone committed a burglary, which is one of the 7 majors, you charge them with possessing stolen property. So you don't charge them with the 7 major. You charge them with something, but you skate around what the charge should be. And in some cases, you ignore the situation altogether. Sometimes you don't have someone to arrest, but you have to take a report. Instead of taking the accurate report to record the actual crime, you downgrade it to something else. And if you don't record it properly, it doesn't get investigated properly, and there's no public safety in that. But the commander's numbers look better quarterly, eventually leading to that promotion.
What about the people reporting these crimes who are saying, like, I'm telling you a home invasion happened and you're saying there was a burglary or something more minor?
Well, they don't tell the people that.
Hmm.
They sit there, they take the report. You think that a burglary is being recorded, but they don't tell the people that. You never see that. The people never see the report.
The other thing about quotas, Edwin, is they can be met. So you had some colleagues who would like reach their quotas early in the month and then just hang out in those hiding spots on their phones or whatever?
That's it. They got the numbers out the way according to the powers that be. They are good cops. They are workers. And then for the rest of the month, they, as we say, they put blinders on. They ignore the public. They stay away from the public. And, there's no service happening anymore. Um, but if you're out there every day and it doesn't organically lead to the quota being met, you're the one that's being pulled into the room to discuss your numbers with the supervisors. You're the one who's getting your days off. the request for days off not approved. You're the one who's getting reprimanded for things, minor things that everyone else does with impunity, and so on and so forth. There's so many ways in which a supervisor in the police department could just play around with your life. If you're on a particular list. Um, yeah, unfortunately.
Yeah, you also explained that once someone has been arrested once, even if that arrest didn't ultimately result in a conviction, they're kind of in the system in a way that makes them vulnerable to future arrests for these really minor violations that everybody else might just get a ticket for.
Correct. It's the transit recidivism policy is a specific policy that the NYPD came up with, and on the surface, it's supposed to deter crime in the subway system. But what happens is, again, creates an entire database of people who, after that one infraction, 99% of the time minor, anything that happens moving forward, they will never qualify for a summons. They have to be arrested. Um, People biting into a jelly donut and the jelly spewing out the donut. People charging their phones. People's phones going off and the ringtone of the phone playing music. I've seen people arrested for all of those things because they're technically in the rule books. The first one would be littering, even though it wasn't intentional. When the jelly hit the floor, that was littering, right? When you charge your phone using the socket that belongs to the MTA, theft of service, and um, sound amplification, unlawful sound amplification for the ringtone. So again, officers are under pressure to get these arrests. I promise you, most people did not join the police department to arrest someone for biting into a jelly donut. But when the pressure is on and there are quotas to be met, and it's an entire demographic of people who have essentially been dehumanized, this is what people end up doing.
And again, it's not as if sort of anybody doing these things is equally targeted. Officers are motivated to look for people that it appears that if they get stopped for something, they're likely to have an arrest warrant. So you tell a story of, I don't know, maybe some NYU girls or, some wealthier looking white girls who committed a violation, women, who committed a violation that was against the law. But can you tell that story? The bag on the
Sure,
seat.
sure. So this is when I was unceremoniously given the midnight shift. Right, I was in my early mid 20s, given the midnight shift. It was one of the worst assignments. Takes a big toll on your personal life. And I heard a colleague requesting a warrant check from the dispatcher. So I made my way over, and I saw it was two young white women about college age, and they could not believe that they were pulled off the train. Remember, it's midnight, so it's about 1 a.m. It's already late. They're on their way home from Manhattan, and they're pulled off the train, just baffled. I helped calm down the situation, and I told them it's because of your bag. It's called outstretched. You're not allowed to take up more than one seat in the train, whether it be a bench on the train platform or the actual train itself. And they could not believe that was a law, and they absolutely could not believe that it was actually being enforced. They were pissed, and rightfully so. This is a city where, even though it's a lot safer than it was 30 years ago, there's still a lot of actual violence happening. But here this officer was pulling them off, running their names to write the two summonses. Yeah, and the main reason they were shocked is because typically, um, two white young women would not be the target of this type of enforcement. That officer, it was later in the month, and that officer just needed summonses, and he decided to write two summonses. They Later on in my career, I would have a commander who you would have to come into his office and explain why you wrote those two summonses. You were essentially only allowed to write summonses to black and brown folks. You were not allowed to write to white women and Asians also. You were not allowed to write to certain Asian groups also.
What happened when you protested this informally on the job at that point?
Oh, whew, I became a pariah. The retaliation started. Um, I wasn't a whistleblower yet. I would just speak my mind again as intelligently as possible. But yeah, they didn't want that. People had bills to pay and had to suppress who they were. Some of them actually became a new person that believed in this stuff. So they didn't want that voice in the background mind reminding them how outrageous this stuff is. And the supervisors obviously didn't want that, because if I influence peers, and there are other officers in the squad, in the platoon, who are not producing, as they call it, producing activity regularly, that's going to hurt the command's numbers. It's going to hurt the commanding officer. So I faced a lot of retaliation.
Edwin, how did you start to think about becoming a whistleblower to report the injustices you had witnessed and were expected to take part in if you wanted to move up within the department?
Chris, I'll tell you, if you would have told me early in my career that this is the journey that my life would have taken, I would have said, no way, no way. While I did want to affect change, I thought I would do it by rising through the ranks and being an example of that change. I never thought I would have to go toe to toe with the largest police department in the country, um, with a $6 billion annual budget, um, about 60,000 employees, of which 35,000 have firearms. Um, it took a lot to get here, though. I literally had to arrive to a point where I put myself completely last. Like, self-sacrifice was out the door. It was, self-preservation was out the door. It was all about self-sacrifice. And it's not what I wanted to do, but it's what I had accepted. Um, I reached to a point where I didn't care what happened to me anymore. And mentally, that's not fair to me. It's very unhealthy. If we're waiting for a whole bunch of cops to reach to the point where they don't care what happens to them, we're never going to get change. Which is why we, as a society, we have to create an environment where being a whistleblower isn't as risky. But to go back specifically to your question, um, yeah, I got to a point where I was ready to give it all up. And once I reached there, it was liberating, because there was no more fear.
What was the result of that lawsuit you were part of? This group that was called the NYPD 12.
Yeah. So we filed the lawsuit. We filed the case in August of 2015. It went through its ups and downs, and unfortunately, in July of 2022, it was dismissed in federal court. My attorneys, they refiled it in state court, but literally just this past was it January, just last month, um, it was dismissed again. And it was very heart wrenching, because, all these years, it's going on 9 years, and it sets a very dangerous precedent. Throughout my journey as an activist in the last 8 years, I've met people that said, you, you give me some hope, but I don't see why you think a lawsuit matters. And I said, because it sets a precedent, creates the case law for other officers to use throughout the nation, right? When the attorneys are able to reference Raymond versus the city of New York and the judge's ruling, other justice-minded officers, um, I'll get into that. They are able to then use the same case. Um, there are people that believe we need violence to get change. This lawsuit being dismissed, think about it. If 12 active New York City police officers are unable to use litigation to change the system, people who have front row seats to the madness are not able to successfully use litigation, then who has a chance? Right? It's vindicating. Those who want violence are going to feel vindicated. Right? In 2016 in Dallas, where we have 5 officers killed at a protest, I listened, I went through the rabbit hole throughout YouTube and other platforms where people are able to leave comments, and the amount of people that felt like, finally, this is what we have to do. It was very scary. And unfortunately, that ruling, those folks, they feel vindicated by feeling that way. It's like, we don't even like cops, but here comes these 12 cops that are doing something so different. They're suing on behalf of the people, and yet they're not even able to get justice. What chance do any of us have?
Why do you think the defund the police movement is a bridge too far, even given the damage you have witnessed to people and to communities by unjust policing?
Well, first we have to define defund, right? I first learned that term in 2016 when I started doing panels, and it was a woman from Chicago. Um, and it was an abolitionist battle cry. This was by defund, they're not talking about reducing funds. They mean eliminate, deflate completely, get rid of. That's not something that I support. Do I support reallocating funds? Absolutely. There are ways in which funds can be used more effectively to provide resources and other social services, especially taking some of the responsibilities outside, away from police officers. If we're reallocating funds for those purposes, I'm fully in support of. So, let's start by the definition of defund. With that definition, the actual abolitionist battle cry, that's what I don't support because um, the mechanism in which to abolish police, it's something we would have to strengthen our social safety net in a way that I don't think any of us alive today will see. And I don't even know if we're even headed in that direction. So who knows when that would happen, if it will ever happen in the United States. So theoretically, would I love a society where we don't need police? Of course. But the steps that we would need to take there, the first step is not abolishing the police. It's not. If we were to get there in the 10-step process, the first step is not starting with the abolition of police.
Edwin Raymond is a 15-year veteran of the New York Police Department and today is a full-time criminal justice reform advocate. His book is called An Inconvenient Cop, My Fight to Change Policing in America. Edwin, thanks very much for this conversation.
Absolutely, Krys. I'll be back anytime you need.
Thank you. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram and subscribe to our podcast any place you like to get podcasts. Just search for KERA Think and it will be there. Or you can listen at our website, think.kera.org. Again, I'm Krys Boyd. Thanks for listening. Have a great day.